I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. This is true oral storytelling. I write every episode myself, and then, like the Scandinavian bards known as skalds, I perform them in one single, flawless take. This is the best episode of SKALD yet. So jump right in here and don't worry about what you've missed. Afterward, once you're hooked, you can always listen to previous episodes of the podcast to catch up, or buy the prose volumes on Amazon for only $2.99. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 57. They made it through. Barely. By the skin of their teeth. They made it through. They had come as close as they could to victory in that hopeless conflict. Less a conflict and more just a mad dash. More, though she was loath to admit it, a retreat. More a dishonorable rout than an actual conflict. They had made it through, but the costs had been dire. And now, on the other side of that dreadful terrain, of that blasted, forsaken region, the Queen of the Fera surveyed what was left of her party, and she took stock of what had been lost. Lost to the Feldren. They'd made it through as quickly as possible. They ran. They fled. They scampered across that blighted earth in a way that filled her with shame. Her people were not cowards. They were not some cringing weaklings, some craven milksops. And these, the Fera that she had brought with her on this most important journey, these were warriors. They were proud warriors. Warriors who were prepared to do anything, to risk anything, who were willing to die to protect their queen and elevate their people. There was no way to protect anyone from that monster's grasp. There was no way to elevate oneself there, in its realm. And so, with regret in their hearts, with an aching in their souls, the warriors had obeyed their queen's commands. They surrounded the palanquin, they put their heads down, and they ran. And as they did so, they fought back tears, as they soon found themselves surrounded by howling cries so terrible that they defied description. For a time, they'd been safe. For a time, they had run unchallenged, unmolested, and the Queen's shamans had suggested that they slow their pace. Perhaps that creature. They avoided saying the name whenever possible. Perhaps that thing was busy elsewhere. Or perhaps, mercifully, after so many decades, it had finally given in to the decay, to the entropy that was the universe's one sole, immutable law. Their queen. She knew better. She didn't need the shamans to detect the evil in that place, the horrible, inescapable loathing that infected every inch of land, every drop of water, and soon even the warriors that she had handpicked for this treacherous, abhorrent mission. As they entered the monster's realm, the sky had darkened. The wind had ceased blowing, and the very colors seemed to seep out of the landscape, leaving only a dull brown morass that seemed to stretch impossibly, even beyond the boundaries of that creature's domain. Though the shamans sheathed themselves in wishful thinking, reassuring themselves that the monster was nowhere in sight. She, their queen, knew better, because though she couldn't see the monster, she could feel it, and soon she could hear it as well. It began as a rumbling, one that seemed to come from beneath the earth, from the very core of that realm, one that made the ground at their feet shake with tremulous fear. But soon, those simple tremors grew to a dull roar, one that came from every direction and none at all, as the queen, her warriors, those loyal subjects carrying the palanquin, and the poor, doomed souls that swarmed around them, panicked, stricken with an all-consuming fear. The old and infirm Farah that had the misfortune to be named a distraction, to be assigned the role of bait for the Feldren. As the rumbling grew, the loathing, the hatred, and the contempt that infected that place began to take root inside the Farah. The old and infirm hated themselves for being able to fill no more noble of a role, and they began to stir, planning to run, planning to abandon the palanquin and filling the air with their wails. The Farran warriors hated the old and infirm for filling their hearts with guilt, for filling their souls with sorrow, for necessitating that they turn their spears upon their own people, to force them to serve in the only way that they could. And she, the queen of the Farah, hated herself, hated her subjects, hated Henno, hated the high elves, hated the savage brute who had taken what was theirs, and most of all, she hated the Feldren. The Feldren. As she thought its name, as she merely let her mind dance over the world, suddenly it was upon them, summoned by their wretchedness and fear. She knew it was large. She had been told that it was the largest thing to ever defile that border realm, but still, she was not prepared. She was not ready. She was wholly shocked and bedazzled by the magnitude of that foul abomination and its heaving, moaning terror. Though the loathing didn't leave them, though the loathing was omnipresent throughout their time in the Feldren's realm, soon the hatred, the contempt, the disgust that her subjects felt was joined by another emotion. Quaking, undeniable fear. A horror that didn't creep or grow, but one that fell upon them fully formed, with an unbelievable vigor, one that turned the wails of her subjects into moaning chants that were far more terrible than any cry she had ever heard, more horrific than any scream for rescue that she could possibly imagine. As the monster reached out, as it touched them with the long, gnarled protuberances that shot out seemingly at random from its body, her subjects, the old and infirm among them, the bait, they fell to the ground. They fell prostrate, groaning in unison, a phrase made more terrible by the mystery surrounding it, by its inexplicable meaning and purpose. They spoke together, joined by the gravelly, scraping, sourceless voice of the Feldren. I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry. Her shamans had been right. Feldren, drawn to their wretchedness, drawn to their pitiable state, had gone first for the old, gone first for the infirm, gone first for those with the shortest distance to fall. Their plan had worked. Their ruse had been successful, and as the Feldren contented itself mindlessly with the poor Farah that it had already cowed, had already laid low, the queen of the Farah did the only thing she could do. She lowered her head, and she ran, crying out, panicked, fearful, not commanding, but begging, pleading with her warriors to follow her. She was a queen. She was their queen, and it was her duty to lead the charge, to lead her people through that dread realm, to lead them to what was theirs, to their salvation, to lead them into a future so bright that it put their race's halcyon past to shame. She had to lead them. She had to move forward. She had to put the horror, the terror behind her and move forward. She knew she couldn't lead without her subjects. She couldn't wage war without her warriors. She couldn't do anything without her people. Though she knew it was a mistake, though she knew that she would gaze upon sights the likes of which would never leave her, she steeled herself. She looked back. First, she'd been relieved. She was overjoyed to see her warriors, to see them still with her, sticking close to her heels, their heads lowered, their eyes averted, anything to avoid the glance, the touch, the presence of that thing, that abomination, that monster. The Feldrun. And behind them, the shamans. Those arrogant fools, those who had been so easily taken in by wishful thinking, those who had been seduced by optimism, those with the audacity to believe that the Feldrun might let them pass through its realm unscathed. They had been foolish. They had been overly optimistic, but they had learned quickly. And now they, like the warriors, ran with heads lowered, with eyes averted. But not all of them. Not all of the shamans, not all of the warriors even. Its ravenous urges unabating, its hunger not yet sated. The Feldrun had turned its many-eyed gaze upon them, had looked out with that petrifying stare, the one that emanated from those countless eyes, the ones that hovered just beneath the surface of the monster's translucent skin, that shivered and moved unpredictably, unnaturally within the horror's body. And the warriors, the shamans, those that she had hand-chosen to accompany her on this journey, they fell under the sway of the Feldrun. The loathing took them in many ways. Some felt it all around them. They felt its weight pressing down upon them. They felt it growing within, looking out, looking inward. They felt the weapons in their hands, felt sword, felt spear, felt arrow. They felt the world as it was, the world as it had always been, the world as it always would be, no matter what happened, no matter what they did. They despaired. And they made the only choice they could. They made the only true choice that mortal men are ever given. They chose when, and they chose how to die. And they were the luckiest. Others, the less lucky, those less willing to allow the loathing to turn inward, they kept their gaze outward. They turned their eyes upon their fellows, turned their swords, their spears, their arrows against them, against warriors, against shamans, against fellow Farah. With tears in their eyes, regretting their decision, regretting everything in their miserable lives, regretting that they were even born, they turned on one another. And as they did, all they gained were more regrets. But they didn't just turn on one another. They also turned on the others, turned on those less lucky than even themselves, turned on those who, filled with loathing, filled with doubt and questions, filled with the knowledge that it was pointless, that it was meaningless, that none of it mattered, they simply stood, comatose, mouths ajar, waiting for the attack, waiting for their slaughter, waiting for the end, waiting for death. And when it came, they welcomed it. And some, the most unlucky, those whom the Feldron was able to snare most easily, to dig in its hooks and spread its vile corruption, they shared the same fate as the distractions, as the old and infirm Farah, as the bait, who now, behind them, fully taken by the Feldron's loathing, it was too terrible. She couldn't bear to look upon it. She couldn't stand the sight of it. She herself felt the loathing plant a seed within her, felt it stretch out and grow unchallenged, felt herself begin to give in, begin to give up until she saw it. The palanquin. The palanquin. It was miraculously still intact. It was miraculously still held aloft. It was miraculously still protected, still moving forward, still moving behind her, still moving through that treacherous realm, through that defiled earth, still moving away from the Feldron. But it moved too slowly. It moved nowhere near fast enough. And so, looking past the carnage, looking past the loathing, looking past the awful, unspeakable, unbearable fate befallen by the most vulnerable of her people, she cried out. No longer panicked, no longer fearful. She cried out valiantly, with the bearing of royalty, with the respect her throne demanded, the throne she had earned, and she urged her people forward. They, her people, her warriors, her shamans, and the brave, giving Farah who held the palanquin aloft, even as their brothers and sisters, twisted by loathing, fell all around them. Even as the air filled with the plaintive cries of that horrible monster, that heaving abomination, that unnatural detestation, they shouldered their burden nobly. They averted their eyes as the shamans had urged them, as they urged them now, emboldened by the bravery of their queen, and together they held the palanquin. They protected it as their queen had commanded them to, and they charged through the Feldron's domain. But that wasn't the end of it. It wasn't as simple as just continuing to run. Would that it were. She would have given anything, almost anything, to make it so. The Queen of the Farah, now safely through, now safely in sight of the ever-growing city of Ravenna, attended by her warriors and her shamans, by what remained of them. She sighed, and she closed her eyes in silent remembrance. She did her best to drive out the images. The horrible images of Farah racked by loathing, of Farah taken by contempt, twisted by enmity. It was impossible. It was impossible because the racking, the loathing, the theft, the contempt, the twisting, and the enmity had all come about because of her. It had all come about because of her commands, because of her orders, because she needed to get to Ravenna and get to Ravenna quickly. She needed to go to Henno. She, the queen of the Pharaoh, the first queen of the Pharaoh, she who had risen to prominence, had risen to rulership, who had carved out a throne and earned the right to sit upon it, to rule a race that was old before that ancient wizard was even born. She had to swallow her pride and go quickly to deal with Henno. She was sickened by the thought of it. Sickened by what they had been through. Sickened by what she had put her people through. Sickened by the callous sacrifice of her people's oldest and weakest. Sickened that she tried to justify it to herself. That she had justified it to herself. That she even could justify it to herself. She was sickened by what she had seen, the indescribable, pulsating horror that the monster embodied, sickened by that abomination, the Feldran, as well as what the creature emanated, sickened by what the detestation's influence had done to her people, at what it had turned them into. But though she was sickened, though she had to struggle to choke down the bile that rose up in her throat unbidden, though her stomach was racked with pangs of nausea so strong they threatened to cast her down ignobly upon the ground, she did not feel guilt. She did not feel regret, because this horrible, unenviable decision, the decision that sickened her on levels that she could not readily express, it had been a necessary one. They had to get to Ravenna. They had to get what was theirs, what was rightfully theirs, what they deserved. They had to get that long, twisting alabaster horn, and they had to get to Ravenna to do it. They had to get there expediently, quickly. Had to get there before any other buyers. Had to get there before Henno changed his mind. Before Henno raised the price. Before that damnable, wicked man could find a way to better twist that twisting horn to his twisted purposes. To his infernal designs. Needed to get there quickly. And with the palanquin, that royal palanquin, the one that held the cargo most precious, most irreplaceable, the cargo most crucial and most valuable, they had to make it to Ravenna, make it to the deal, make it to that long, twisting alabaster horn. With the palanquin intact. And for that goal, for that vital goal, for the goal that held the key to their race's future survival, to their civilization's ability to thrive and grow. For that goal, there was no cost too great. They had done the unthinkable. They had cut through that abomination's realm, and though their losses were heavy, though she had paid far more than she would have liked, it was still far less. And she had been willing. She would have sacrificed every warrior, every shaman under her command. If it was possible, she would have carried the massive royal palanquin by herself, and she would have done it gladly, done it joyously, because now all that remained was the easy part. She opened her eyes and looked out at the horizon. Looked out at that disgusting, filthy city. Looked out at Ravenna. And she sneered at how it had grown, how its narrow, winding streets continued to stretch out across the earth like a malignant tumor, like the blight upon creation that it was. As she had been since childhood, as she had been for as long as she could remember. She was disgusted by the city, disgusted by its unchecked growth, by the bodies crushed and forgotten in its heedless expansion, by the forests and wild places burned to fuel its nightmarish engines, and she was disgusted by Ravenna's unchecked hunger, the seeming inevitability of that corrupted and corrupting city, devouring her entire world. But still, one good thing did come from Ravenna's unsustainable, spasming growth. Now, on the other side of the Feldrin's realm, she, the queen of the Fera, could see Ravenna clearly, and she could see that the city's heavy, artless iron gates were less than a day's march away. She and her people were less than a day's march away from Ravenna, from Henno, from the terrible deal she would have to make, from what they had earned, from what they had suffered for, from what was rightfully theirs. And soon, so very soon, that long, twisting alabaster horn and victory, final, crushing, undeniable victory, the final, crushing, unconditional surrender of the High Elves. It would all finally be within her grasp. So she marshaled her forces. She spoke words of encouragement to hearten her people, to buttress them in the face of the terrors they had just confronted. She promised them that the way back would be easier, the way back would be better, as they took the long way, as they traversed the snowy mountain peaks of the north. And then, unsheathing her gleaming sword, she pointed ahead, and they set off for Ravenna. I hope you're digging SKALD. If you are, then please help The Only Story That Matters reach even more people by reviewing the show on iTunes. And if the review you leave is a good one, I might just read it on the show. Shirtzos says, 5 stars. SKALD is grow hair on your chest entertainment. Each and every week, The Only Story That Matters is brought to you through the donations of SKALD fans on Patreon. Without them, without the small monthly dollar amounts they pledge to keep this show going, there's absolutely no way I could have come this far. If you love SKALD as much as I do, become a patron today by signing up at patreon.com/SKALD. Please talk about SKALD on social media, and make sure to tag me so I can share your posts. I'm Aubrey Sitterson on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Snapchat, and I am shameless. I share all compliments and all positive reviews. You can also hit up aubreysitterson.com for links to everything, including SKALD, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, my comics work, bio, contact information, and more. This week's recommendation is a comic book that I am currently obsessed with. It's Walt Simonson's Ragnarok. Simonson is best known for his character-defining work on Thor in the 1980s, and with Ragnarok, he makes a triumphant return to Norse mythology. Instead of having to shoehorn things into pre-existing continuity, however, with Ragnarok, Simonson has the freedom to create a mythological world from the ground up, and the results are spectacular, especially seeing as Simonson is collaborating with color art genius Laura Martin. Pick up the hardcover today. You won't be sorry. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.